Allow me to introduce myself.
I am the last sane sports fan.
I am a genius by trade.
I just knew too much. Does that make me crazy? Does that make me crazy? Does that make me crazy? Possibly.
Hello everyone and welcome once again to The View from the Midwest as we continue our look at the NHL playoffs. Yesterday we talked about day number 1 of the NHL playoffs, which actually kicks off tonight. I wanted to kind of take the preview and do it a day ahead of time. So yesterday we talked about today's matchups, which are going to be Ottawa versus Montreal, the Islanders versus Washington, Chicago versus Nashville, and Calgary versus Vancouver. You can go ahead and check out yesterday's videos to see who I ended up picking in those. Just as kind of a refresher, I did pick a couple upsets based on seedings. You can't necessarily take that at face value. But ultimately, it should be a really interesting first round of playoff matchups. But let's look at the ones that are going to start on Thursday. And let's just get the big elephant, the 300-pound gorilla, whatever you might want to use as a euphemism, out of the way. The St. Louis Blues are going to take on the Minnesota Wild. And I almost felt like recusing myself from even picking on this one because I will freely admit I am not unbiased in this. I am completely biased. If I take off my fan hat and still look at things in terms of as a broadcaster, as a journalist, as someone who's trying to get into this business, it's something that I think the St. Louis Blues were going to win anyway. I would have picked them to win regardless of who my heart told me was going to win. I think the St. Louis Blues are really clicking right now. The big key, I think, in this one is going to be goaltending, and it was just announced a little while ago that Jake Allen is going to be the St. Louis Blues goaltender. The headline said only for game number 1, but you have to go for a goaltender. I mean, unless he just blows up, you have to go with a goaltender for the entire series. And I think Jake Allen is the way to go. He played well enough down the stretch, and he has a certain calmness about him, and I think that's what's reassuring to the team. Nothing against Brian Elliott. He did a spectacular job. He was an all-star, but he was also an all-star back in 2012, and that didn't carry over into the playoffs. He didn't perform very well against the Los Angeles Kings in that year. Now, granted, the team didn't perform in front of him, but it's just another interesting little tidbit that kind of goes against Brian Elliott. And I think Jake Allen is going to do an excellent job. The thing that's going to be interesting in this series is St. Louis was red hot going into the playoffs for the first time in quite some time. They have a healthy team for the first time in quite some time. All their stars are back. All of them are fresh. All of them are ready to get a good playoff run in them. On the flip side, the Minnesota Wild had to play playoff hockey for the better part of a month, if not longer, just to get into the playoffs. But the thing that might come back and bite them is the fact that they expended so much energy, and you saw it down the stretch. They lost a few games towards the end of the season, which could have improved their playoff standing. Instead, they ended up in a wild card spot with a record of 46-28 and 8. If my eyes would want to work right now. But the St. Louis Blues ended up in the Central Division champion. They were tied with Anaheim for the top spot in the West, and the tiebreakers obviously went to the Ducks. But Minnesota's going to present a challenge in the fact that they have one of the hottest goaltenders in the league in Devin Dubnyk. Dubnyk ended up finishing the regular season, I should say, number 2 in goals against average with 2.07, and he was actually the best in the league in terms of goals against average since he arrived in Minnesota. So he was playing with the Arizona Coyotes, and he managed to do such a good job with them to keep his goals against average down. Improved it even more with a defensive team in Minnesota. And they are going to have to really rely on him. Minnesota does have some good scoring. They've got Zach Parise. They've got some good defending. They've got a good overall mix. But if everybody plays at the top of their game for both teams, St. Louis has the edge because they have the better players 1 through 9, and maybe even include in the top 4 lines. I just don't know that Minnesota can match up with that, because when you sit there and take Vladimir Tarasenko and Alexander Steen, stick them back into this team for the St. Louis Blues, now that they've come back from injury, and they might be playing on the third line. It depends on how Coach Ken Hitchcock wants to kind of mix and match and put people together. But the way that people played while they were out, if you give them the top 2 lines and then just stick Yuri Laterra between Steen and Tarasenko and play them on a third line, maybe even a second line, then all of a sudden I don't think there's any way that Minnesota can match up. The big key here is going to be physical play. I think Minnesota is going to try to do what the Chicago Blackhawks did last year, which is not necessarily dirty play, but they're going to go headhunting. They're going to try to take the Blues out of this series with physical play. The Blues by no means are going to get pushed around, but they have to find an answer for that, whether it be Ryan Reeves on the ice, seeing an extra time, maybe a couple double shifts here and there. But I think the St. Louis Blues are going to win this one. The interesting question for me will be, how many games will it go? If St. Louis just runs roughshod, gets a bunch of goals early in the games, I think they could win in 5. If they don't, if they let Minnesota hang around and let Dubnyk catch fire, then it could go all the way to 7. I still think the St. Louis Blues come out on top in that matchup. Next, we'll look at the other late-night matchup that's going to occur on Thursday, the Anaheim Ducks against the Winnipeg Jets, as Winnipeg sold out their playoff tickets in 5 minutes. The Canadian fans up there have been clamoring for playoff hockey, and they're going to see some good matchups with the Anaheim Ducks. They're a big physical team. They have a lot of strength, a lot of skill. Winnipeg, they're going to bash you around. They're going to crunch you into the boards, and that's going to be a big key for them to try to get into this series if they have any hopes of winning it. The interesting thing with this matchup is going to be who dictates the style of play, because as we've seen the last couple times that Anaheim has been in the playoffs, they've worried a little too much about what their opponent was doing, and whether you want to lay that on Coach Bruce Boudreau, easy for me to say, or just the players themselves, they just haven't done enough to impose their will on their opponents. They played the Detroit Red Wings in the final year in the Western Conference for the Red Wings in 2013. They allowed the Red Wings to play their style of game. They played the Dallas Stars, a very plucky team, last year. They allowed them to get under their skin. And Winnipeg is the exact same kind of team that Dallas was last year. They don't necessarily have the same scoring punch top to bottom, but they have that kind of physical presence, especially with Dustin Byfuglien, Andrew Ladd. They're tough, hard-nosed players. They're going to try to get under the skin of these Anaheim Ducks. I actually see this game, or this series, going 7. But then again, I've predicted a lot of these series to go long stretches, and there's always 1 or 2 series where they're over in 4 or 5. But I think Anaheim will come out on top of this one. I think they have the skill. I think they've been there enough. Their biggest question is going to be goaltending. They are trying to decide right now between Frederik Andersen and Josh Gibson, both of whom have played very well. Frederik Andersen kind of in the Brian Elliott camp, where he played the majority of the season, did very well for them in the early going. Gibson has kind of come on here late. I don't know as much about their goaltending situation. The St. Louis Blues, they come in, and people are going to say, well, Dubnyk is so hot, why don't you pick the Minnesota Wild? Well, if you look at the overall team statistics, the St. Louis Blues goaltending and save percentage is right on par with Devan Dubnyk and the Minnesota Wild. It's just kind of a question, well, you hear goalie controversy, you assume somebody isn't playing very well. It's quite the opposite case with the St. Louis Blues. Down the stretch, both have played very well. It's just a question of you have two goalies, which one do you start? I don't necessarily know that that's the situation in Anaheim. They better hope that it is, because otherwise Pavlich has played well enough for Winnipeg for them to actually come up with an upset. But I think top to bottom, Anaheim just has too much for the Winnipeg Jets. If Winnipeg can manage to keep up that physical play for an entire series and really take the Ducks out of their game, that is how they're going to win. But I think the Ducks end up coming out, and I say it's going to go 6 or 7. Now let's move out east to taking a look at the Tampa Bay Lightning versus the Detroit Red Wings. My former employer, sort of, John Cooper. He used to coach the St. Louis Bandits, who are a junior hockey team here in St. Louis. He's now the head man for the Tampa Bay Lightning, and he's got them rolling. It's not hard to do when you've got the kind of scoring that they do, but you have to give him a lot of credit. He's done a great job down there in Tampa Bay. The Lightning finished 50-24-8, taking on the Detroit Red Wings in their 24th straight year in the playoffs. They came close to missing, and I was hoping, I gotta admit, that they were going to miss, because 25 straight years is what the Blues made, all the way up through 2004. The Red Wings trying to eclipse that record with a couple more playoff runs. They finished the year 43-25-14. Interestingly enough, though, over the course of the regular season, although Tampa Bay is known for scoring, and they score in spades, they actually had the better goals against average. They only allowed 2.49 goals a game. Detroit was at 2.57, and a huge factor in this one is going to be playoff inexperience in terms of the net. You have Ben Bishop, who hasn't really seen a whole lot of playoff action time with the Tampa Bay Lightning. How is he going to react to all that, especially playing a team that's players are a little bit more seasoned in terms of the playoff run, in terms of Detroit, but not necessarily quite as skilled as they have been in the past. But on the flip side, you have almost a mirror image. Getting his very first playoff action is Peter Mrazek, who is actually going to get the start in goal for the Detroit Red Wings, electing not to go with Jimmy Howard, at least for the first few games. Maybe if Mrazek falters early, Howard will get some action, but as of right now, they're going to go with the hot rookie that they've had coming up from the AHL. He's kind of been labeled, kind of like Jake Allen with the St. Louis Blues. He's been labeled as their goalie of the future. A lot of people thought maybe it would be next year, even the year after that Mrazek would really take hold. But Coach Mike Babcock is going with the rookie this year and trying to ride him as much as they can. Some key statistical factors all favoring the Lightning. They're better on the penalty kill. They're better point percentage. They manage to really score the puck. I mean, they are just unbelievable right now, leading the league in terms of team scoring. 259 goals scored, only 206 allowed. That's pretty good defensively for them as well. They were really a steady defensive team. They weren't going to wow anybody with their physical prowess or necessarily banging people around, but they play a good, solid defensive hockey game. Ben Bishop was excellent in the net for most of the year. He had a couple times out with injury, but when you score 259 goals, which is 11 more than the next team that made the playoffs. The only team that was even close to them in the regular season was Dallas, and they didn't even make the playoffs due to their poor defensive showing. But they have a .910 save percentage, so Bishop is going to give you a lot of steady time in the net. Detroit is always Detroit. Somehow they manage to find a way to win games, to get into the playoffs, no matter what kind of talent they have. They've got an excellent coach in Mike Babcock. I just don't see them getting out of the first round this year. If Mrazek just plays out of his skull and stands on his head, making butterfly saves and rolling around like Dominic Hasek used to do and keeping his team in the game, maybe they could pull something off. I think this one is going to be one of the few series that ends somewhat early. I see Tampa Bay winning in 5 or 6 and carrying on to the next round. Wrapping up our look at Thursday's matchups, we've got the President's Trophy winning New York Rangers against the Pittsburgh Penguins. Key statistical factors for you here. 2.28 was the goals against per game for the New York Rangers, 2.49 for Pittsburgh. So despite the fact that Marc-Andre Fleury led the league in shutouts in the regular season, the only goaltender to get to 10, double digits, I just think that the New York Rangers are going to be too much. They finished 53-22-7. The Pittsburgh Penguins ended up finishing 43-27-12. As I mentioned, they pretty much backed their way into the playoffs. Took a last day win to try to pick that one up. But the Rangers, I don't see them going necessarily as far as they should. A lot of people are picking them to win the Cup after going to the finals last year and losing out to L.A. I think they'll make a decent run at the playoffs this year, but I just don't know that they're going to end up going all the way. I think they're going to take Pittsburgh fairly easily, though. I think this one's going to go 5. The New York Rangers are going to come out on top. They had a .923 save percentage as a team, which is actually one of the best marks in terms of all the playoff teams, even the ones that went in with some hot goaltending. They really managed to have a good save percentage. They keep their penalty minutes low. They haven't drawn a whole lot, so they're not necessarily going to get a whole lot in terms of power play chances. But when you keep yourself out of the box, you give yourself a real good chance to win. Only 712 penalty minutes as a team. That sounds pretty high, but when you consider there are 3 teams with 900 minutes, including the St. Louis Blues or more in the playoffs, 700 really isn't that bad a mark. So St. Louis going to beat Minnesota. New York is going to take down Pittsburgh. Tampa Bay is going to make fairly easy work of Detroit, barring any kind of miracle there. And Anaheim will take over Winnipeg. As always, comment, rate, and subscribe down there. I'll include a link to yesterday's video as well in the description, so you can just kind of have a little marathon viewing here of my playoff predictions for the NHL. Enjoy the hockey. It really should be an excellent playoff run, regardless of who you root for.
Let the games begin.
Obviously, here we're cheering for a certain team. You can kind of tell by the decor. So I'll have to wait and see how my playoff predictions play out. That's the view from the Midwest. Until the next time, see you then.
I remember when I lost my mind. There was something so pleasant about that place. Even your emotions have an echo in so much space.